we're going to go over this on your narrative assignment, your narrative essay. We'll go over it today. On Friday, you're going to have a guest speaker. His name is Gary Dickert. He's going to talk to you about the narrative process, organizing your ideas. He's here. He's like a public relations specialist for Lamar, community outreach specialist. But he's also a local writer with many stories that have been published. So he's going to talk to you about the craft and the process that he goes through. Your essays will be next Friday. And I'll give you more detail about those on Friday or on Monday. But I just want to go over some big picture stuff today. So the first thing I want you to think about is what you want to write about. Now, you have 3 prompts that you can write over. The first prompt is that you can really, if you have a story that you want to tell, it can be first-person point of view, it can be third-person point of view, and it can be anything you want. If it's a fantasy story, I don't care. If you have something that you want to write about specifically, then you may write about it. Now, the vast majority of you in here, the vast majority of my students are not in that boat. They don't have a lot of practice writing short stories. They have no desire and have not tried to be the next Stephen King or Anne Rice or J.K. Rowling or whomever. And that's completely fine. But if you're in that boat and you want to write a story, I do not want to stop you from doing so because it will probably be very good. So I want you to write a story if you have one already in mind. Now, for the rest of you and the majority of you that don't know what you want to write about, here are 2 prompts. The first is on page 165, section 2 here. Write a narrative about an experience that dramatically changed your view of the world. The experience might have been jarring and painful, or it might have been positive and uplifting. In either case, recount the incident with compelling narrative details. To illustrate the shift in your perspective, begin with a brief statement of the way you viewed the world before the experience. So you would be dealing with a flash forward and or flashback kind of situation or scenario in this story. Now, there's some other stuff here about Maya Angelou and Langston Hughes and Alice Walker's Beauty. You don't have to reference those or read those. This is just for extra stuff. You don't even have that in your handout available to you. If you wanted to look those up and go deeper, you can. But at the very core, this is what this right up here is what I want from you. Okay. So this is one prompt, and the other is taken from George Orwell's Shooting an Elephant on page 175. Page 175, selection 2. Write a narrative essay about an experience that gave you, like Orwell, a deeper insight into your own nature. You may have discovered, for instance, that you can be surprisingly naive, compassionate, petty, brave, rebellious, or good at something. This is going to be a particular incident. A lot of students, they tend to write stories about like their senior year in high school or something. You can't write your pages. Your paper is going to be about 3 to 4 minimum 3 to 4 pages long. And you can't tell me about your senior year in high school like in 3 pages, 4 pages. Just not going to happen because you're not going to be able to provide me any details, and that's way too long to be able to give you a good descriptive story. So you're going to want to talk about an incident, not a long period of time. Okay? If you look at this, though, an example, or how we tie this back into the story, right, of how Orwell, his experience gave him deeper insight into his own nature. One of the things that he was discovering was his supposed identity versus his national identity, or rather, how much his national identity really made up his own personal identity that he was not aware was there in the first place. And it wasn't until he removed himself from his environment that he was able to understand, right? He saw, like in his mind, he knew, right? He knew that he was an agent of a government that was doing an unjust thing in a part of the world that it should not be a part of or should not be in. He knew that, right? But whenever people would like sneer at him, or they would be negative or aggressive towards British women, as an expression of them not wanting these invaders in their country. What did Orwell feel? What did he want? What did he want to do to them? Huh? He wanted to hurt them. He got angry at them. He got defensive. Why? Why would he get defensive? He knows that they have every reason to be that way towards him. He agrees with them. Yeah, but he didn't know why, right? And that's an important thing, that these conflicts are an instance or a series of instances that can reveal something about yourself that you didn't know was there. That is that's a true revelation of your character, right? Because you ought to believe that you are something, right? But you like to think that you know who you are, and you like to think that you have these characteristics, but you ultimately do not know that until you put yourself in a situation. And we all like to believe that we would be one thing, but ultimately you never know unless you put yourself in that situation. This is a perfect example of this kind of stuff. I mean, I always find it interesting. I mentioned a little bit before, like we so desperately want to separate the body and the mind, and mental endurance or mental like fitness and thought and trying to achieve more with your mind. We don't really at all want to equate that with doing the same thing with your body or physically, but it very much is the same thing. And so, with something physical, like with athletics, for example, now it's crazy. Like people care so. Like I don't, but my friends that I watch football with, they care so much about the combine and the draft. Like for them, the draft is almost as important as the Super Bowl. And what's the draft about? What happens during the draft? Yeah, teams pick players. That's it, right? And so much goes into who's going to be the first pick, first round, second pick, and how that can immediately kind of cement your status in the league almost for the rest of your life. But that doesn't really who's the best quarterback of all time? I hate him. I don't like him. But yes,
Drew Brees.
Oh, get out of here. No, it's not Drew Brees. Tom Brady. He's got more rings. He's got more credentials. He's got more second half comebacks. He's a machine. I don't like him because he plays for the Patriots, and I'm a Cowboys fan. And it's just too perfect. But he's the greatest quarterback of all time. Anybody know what round what round Tom Brady got picked in the what round Tom Brady got picked in the draft? He was sixth or something. He was a nobody. He came from basically a nobody school, and for most people, right, that's someone that would be completely written off. You know, any first round draft picks virtually do nothing in the league, just in the NFL. But it can work within the NBA or any sport really, right? It doesn't matter what you do in practice. It matters what you do on the actual game day, because that's what counts. Allen Iverson has this hilarious interview, and these journalists were trying to give him crap for doing a half-hearted practice, and he just keeps on talking out there and throughout the interview. It's practice, man. It's practice. Why are you asking me about practice? You're not asking me about the game. You're asking me about practice. Because practice really, obviously you have to practice to be able to do something well. But if you only practice well, but you don't put yourself during the game, if you don't perform, are you a good player? No, you're a good practicer, but you're not a good player. So boxers and fighters see this all the time. They'll be killers in the gym. They'll be knocking people out left and right because there's other safety procedures, safety measures taken within practice, and they can just go all day long. But if you take that same person and you put them in a ring or an octagon or cage, whatever it is, and then the cage door shuts, it's just you and another person, you become a different person, because that's whenever it matters. And there's tons of top-ranked fighters that are they're not that great in practice, but you put them in a cage, and then that's where they actually shine, because they're real fighters and they're real performers, versus someone that's just good at practice. A completely different thing, right? So it's not till you remove yourself from whatever situation that you feel comfortable in that makes you feel that you are this thing, and then you're put into that situation okay, maybe I'm not this thing. Like the Scared Straight, the Scared Straight shows that they would have all the time? It's 13, 14-year-old thugs and gangsters and stuff, and want to be hardened criminals, and then they put them in with just the worst of the worst, and you start to see them implode because gravity is just crushing them. They can't shrink their body language enough because they're about to find out what a hard person is really like, right? And they realize that they're not as hard as they thought that they were. So these conflicts that you can be put into, right? That shows that is, and that's important. Right? That shows your true character, and that reveals something about yourself. The majority of the time, like you want to, the majority of the time, it's really not a positive thing, right? The majority of the time, you, unless you really anticipated it, unless you've really trained for it, unless you've really prepared for it, the majority of the time, people don't really rise to the occasion. Especially if there's a conflict or something that happens that's completely unexpected. Most of the time, it reveals something about yourself that you really wish wasn't there. And because you know this, you then have the requirement, because you know that you are lacking in this area, that you have to take this thing that is inside of you and you have to hammer it out and make it not exist or make it better than what it was. I lived. I told you guys before. I lived overseas for a long time. I lived in Cambodia for about 8 or 9 months, and where I lived in Cambodia was very, very bad. It was like I lived in the true ghettos with no running water and no electricity, and I fought for a living. And so the gym where I was like kind of taken in at, we all lived together in the gym. There was like a dozen fighters there, and no one like really wins money. Like you win, and like the money kind of goes to the school, and then the teacher or the head of the school kind of partitions out that money. So you're all kind of fighting for each other. And I grew up in Bridge City, and I didn't have like a rough upbringing. I was raised around rough people, but we never went hungry or anything. So I never really experienced true hunger until I lived overseas, and I got to know what that was about. It sucked, and I never really understood. There were people that grew up around me that did go to bed hungry, and like on other like sides of the street, I guess, or other parts of the neighborhood that were really poor. And so I would never understood how someone like could not like someone because of their appearance. Like if a kid like went to school with like a nice polo shirt on, you'd have like that dirty poor kid that just doesn't like them. And because I was never like that really dirty poor kid, so I really never understood that. But I thought that I had like I thought that I had like more character in me to be so low, and I realized that I didn't, because after 2 years really of fighting overseas and about 7 or 8 months in Cambodia, I got to the point where I was I was like 165 pounds or so. I was really, really skinny. And I saw this kid like walking down the street. And in Cambodia, there's like 2 obvious classes, and most everybody there is dirty and poor, but there are a few people that are not. And I saw this Khmer kid, and he was like 12 years old, and he was wearing like a nice like Tommy Hilfiger, but it wasn't. There's all like rip-offs. They don't have like Tommy Hilfiger. They have like Tammy Hilfiger. And they have Rolex watches, not Rolex watches, but it still looks pretty nice. And he was eating. They have like fried ice cream over there. You can buy on the side of the street. And he was eating fried ice cream in a little gold chain, and he had this like little polo shirt. He was like 12 years old, and I was a 24-year-old young man, and I just wanted to crush him with my hand. And I could have, because like, who does this, like, how you are in my space with fried ice cream and a nice shirt and a shower that you probably got from running water, not from like, I shower with like collected rainwater. How dare you be in my space? I will end your whole life and your whole family because of that damn fried ice cream. And then I was jealous of a 12-year-old boy at 24, and I was like, I've got some work to do on myself. And I spent like years like fighting people to become like this, like a pretty like rough guy, by any stretch of the imagination. But then I say a little kid that has something that I don't have, and then I turn myself into into a child that has a temper tantrum. That like I never because I would never experience that side of life. I'd never experienced true poverty. I never experienced true hunger, and I never experienced true jealousy over something so trivial. Right, as opposed to like, like my dad got a 4-wheeler, my dad got like a 2x4 4-wheeler, my dad got like my neighbor got like a 4-wheel drive 4-wheeler. Like, oh, that's kind of cool. What's up with that? Like, that's not true jealousy over something that really matters, right? Or what you imagine that matters. So through conflicts like that, when you don't see them coming, right? Most of the time, it reveals something about yourself that you really wish wasn't there in the first place. And if you take it all the way back to Plato's allegory of the cave and a narrative and a story about yourself, then you're like, okay, I've been enlightened, and whenever you see the sun, like whenever you're enlightened, it hurts your eyes, right? Well, then you've been enlightened to your true nature. Most of the time, your true nature is not something that you're proud of, right? So you shy away from your true nature, and you don't acknowledge that thing that conflict brought up in you, right? It's like when people get in fights in relationships, and they have a conflict with themselves, with their other partner, and they don't sit down and work it out and hammer it out, like this is this thing, like it hurts my eyes. I don't want to acknowledge this truth about my nature. Let's just shy our way from it. Let's not acknowledge it. Let's not work it out. That thing always comes back, and then it's like a dragon that grows and grows and grows and grows and grows, right? So conflict in stories are extremely important because it reveals the inner nature of the person that is undergoing that conflict. And again, the vast majority of the time, it's not great. But that's a good thing, right? It's good that it's not a good thing because that leads you to change, right? Very, very few people undergo a conflict, realize that they are the superhero in their own story, and they just go about like ripping off their shirt, having their superhero uniform under them at all times because like you're not like nobody is that person. If you are, then like you shouldn't be in here. You should be like leading world peace because that's not any of us here. So with your stories, whenever you let me turn this on. What I want you to do today, besides figuring out what you want to write about, there are a couple different ways that you can go about mapping out your ideas and planning your story. So, what you've got is with your regular essays, like whenever we move on to like a definition or compare and contrast, cause and effect essay, those are definite essays that will be like blocked out. You can have really solid outlines with like this paragraph, I'm going to talk about this. This paragraph, I'm going to talk about this. Narratives, you have a different paragraph structure. And like if you start using dialogue, if you have like 3 sentences in, and then you start using dialogue, you need to go to another paragraph. And then each paragraph can just be 1 or 2 lines of dialogue going back and forth. And you can't really map that out like on an outline like you can on a compare and contrast essay. Like this paragraph, I'm going to talk about this topic. This paragraph, I'm going to talk about this topic. So on a narrative, it's a little bit, your overall story paragraph structure is a little different. You can look back to the examples in your book, though, the student essay and the other essays that we read, to look at the paragraph structure. But when you're first starting out, right, the first thing that you need to do is you need to identify your point, and you need to identify your conflict. So I'm going to show you a couple different ways of really doing this. Now, I'll talk about, or I'll use as an example, the story of like me and my wife, and I talked about like us fighting the night before. I wake up the next morning, I don't kiss her goodbye, and then I get in my truck, I almost get into a wreck, I blow out, and then I almost died, and I fight my truck, and then I get back on the side of the road, calm down, I go back and I kiss my wife, and make up with her and all that stuff, because I realized through that conflict what I could have lost. So, the point of my story. The point of my story could be about love, anger, and forgiveness. Loss. There are many things that revolve around my central point of this story, right? It could be somewhere, or it could be all of these, or somewhere in the middle. And then the conflict would be fight with wife or fight with truck, or really both of them, right? But the main conflict is the fight with my truck. The underlying conflict is the fight with my wife. And then the underlying conflict under that is the fight with myself, right? The conflict of, should I say goodbye? Should I carry on this anger? Should I let it go, or should I seek to resolve it? I'm the one that always has to apologize to my wife. Why can't she apologize to me? So let's just drag this thing out. Many levels of conflict there. If you look at your story structure, remember I told you that your stories are not like this with a start and an end. Okay? Your stories need to have resolution, and they need to have that in this form. Let's say that I start at, just as an example, I start at home angry with my wife. Angry or in a fight with my wife. One of the two, right? That's where I start. As I go, I have a conflict with my truck. that then causes me to go back to my wife, to go back home. I need to go back home and resolve this conflict with my wife. So the story comes full circle, and it goes back onto itself, and it resolves itself in the exact same place, not only in the exact physical space that the conflict occurred, but also with the exact person which the initial conflict occurred. So that is a full resolution of a story.
What if it's a group of people, not just a specific person? And I'm talking about writing in Orwell, the way Orwell wrote about the inner.
Well, his conflict was his own internal conflict, right? And that was not something where he went back and he, some stories they don't. I mean, it's not like you can go back and like bring the elephant to life, right? It's not like you could go and dig the elephant's grave and then, some of it. Here, the most important thing is the resolution of the conflict. I was just using this as an example. You have two layers of resolution. One, I resolve the conflict with my wife. He resolves the conflict with his internal struggle by acknowledging that it's there in the first place. And that's the most important thing. Like when you acknowledge that something is, with the internal conflict, you acknowledge that it's there. Which the moment you acknowledge that the conflict is there, you can then begin to work on it. And that's what we talked about before, like the dragon, right? By acknowledging that it's there, half of the work is done. I mean, that's like it's taken from like Alcoholics Anonymous. Like the first step in AA is what? Hopefully none of you really know, but like inherently, what's the first step in AA? Acknowledging you got a problem. Yeah, you got to acknowledge you got a problem first, and then we can work on it. So, in Orwell's story, it's the acknowledgement of his lack of identity or his identity as being different than what he thought it was. Yes, ma'am.
So our conflict can be with our inner selves due to something that happened?
Should always be that. Yeah, that's how most stories have meaning, right? It's an external conflict leads to an inner conflict.
But we don't have to have a resolution with someone else. It could be a resolution with ourselves.
100%, yeah.
Okay.
Right. I'm just using it for the example of this story, right? Like I said, Orwell, his conflict was internal, so he had to resolve that internally. Just in this story, if you're looking at levels and structure, it physically occurs here. I leave, I have a conflict, and then I physically return back to the same person that I had a conflict with in the first place that caused me to leave angry, and I resolve that with them, right? So it's a tight structure. Yes, ma'am.
And this can be like a fictional story?
Yeah, it can be 100% fictional. Yeah, and we're going to get to that in a second. So this is our structure. This is my basic story arc here, and I'll just map it out for you so you can visually see this. Also here, so I've got my point and I've got my conflict. So let's say that you're this type of person, right? So let's say that I do this. Okay. So, I identify my plot and my conflict. And then what I want to do is I want to just have this it's just mind dump all the details that I can around it. So I'm looking at okay, well, all right, so here, let's say this is the wreck itself, right, or the flat tire itself. Okay, well, I got a blowout. And it's, I don't know, so the weather was good. There's no traffic on the road, which makes it ironic that I would almost die in a car accident with no traffic on the road. The blowout sounds like a gunshot. The wheel is extremely shaky. You can go into details about that. I talked about here. I had breakfast, had cereal, I shampooed my hair, I took a shower. My wife is asleep. She's under the covers, but there's no blanket. She's got some hair. She's asleep. She's got hair across her cheek, and my kids are in bed with her. Now, some people, this is the best way to get their ideas out, to recall those memories in as much detail as they can. But many people, this is not how their minds work, and they work better if they do it chronologically. So, let's say that I first thing I do is I have a fight with wife. Then I go to bed, or we go to bed. No kiss. And angry. Okay, so I've got 11 series of events here that I just basically laid out. So if you want to lay it out in chronological order, you say that, okay, well, first I had a fight with my wife, then I went to bed angry, or we went to bed angry with no kiss. Then I woke up, then I got ready, then I came in and I looked at my wife angry and decided whether or not to kiss her or wake her up and tell her I love her. I leave in anger. On the way, after I've left, I have a blowout. Then I have a fight with my truck. And then after I wrestle my truck, I resolve that fight. I bring it back on the side of the road. Then I decide to return home. And then I resolve the fight with my wife. Okay, so this is a chronological series of events, right? This happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. So whenever you look at it, you can go back and you're like, okay, well, it happened in this order. But I don't have to tell it in this order, right? So I can just say that this, right? I used this example before. I can use this first. Okay? We have a flashback. Or this can be the present tense, and then I can have a flashback. So first, I'll open up with, I stood over my wife wondering what to do. And then, after that, I can go back to here. The night before, we had a fight about X, Y, and Z. We went to bed with no kiss because we were angry. And after I woke up and got ready, all I could think about was whether or not to kiss her goodbye or whatever. And then I'm brought back to this present point. Or then I'm flash forward to here. All right? And then I leave. And then I go through and I do all of this stuff. And then here, fight with my truck could be a flash forward. And during that flash forward, I see the life that I would lose all out in front of me. Okay? So you here, by mapping out, first this happens, then this, and this, and this, and this, and this, and this. You don't have to stick to this, right? It allows you to get all the series of events out so that you can then arrange them in a more dynamic way. So next what you got to do, and here, like when you're looking at this is the same thing, right? You can have each of these points could be just points off of this map. I didn't do all of them because it's just too much to do with the time frame that we've got. But as you're going back, and when you're looking at this idea map, I'm like, all right, well let me see here. Okay, I've got this. This happens. Okay, all this is good, right? Well, what I had for breakfast, what kind of cereal I had, a shampoo, shower, like that doesn't matter. Right? Like that doesn't inform the story anymore for you, other than the fact that as I was getting ready, I was thinking about the fight with my wife. And that could be a sentence. But I don't need to put, like, as I pour my cornflakes and my half and half in my coffee and my da-da. You don't need to put all of that detail into it because it doesn't matter. Here, my wife being asleep, when I look at her, she's under the covers. She's got no blanket over. She's got hair across her cheek. The kids are in bed with her. Those are important details because that informs the narrative and that pushes the story forward. Another thing to talk about here, my kids are in bed with her, and this is true. Like right now, my kids are in bed. Well, she better be awake now, but she is. But so my kids were in bed with my wife this morning. Actually, we've been in two separate beds. We're in a loving marriage, but my wife and my youngest son are very, very sick. And in an attempt to keep myself and my older daughter not sick, we slept in two different beds. Newsflash, it hasn't worked. So this morning, I put my daughter in bed with my wife as I left because I leave at 5 in the morning. And when I have this conflict with my truck, I have a flash forward, and I think about my wife and also think about my children. Now, if I have a flash forward in my truck and I have not introduced my children to you, and then I start talking about my children, Is that going to be a problem? Yeah, because like I have a wife. Like, well, then why don't you talk about his kids? Where do these people come from, right? So if you're going to introduce characters in a story, if you're going to have characters that are important in a story, you have to introduce them. And in this way, I see my wife and my kids in bed. Okay. If they weren't in bed with my wife, then I could say that I walked past my children's room quietly so that I didn't wake them up and make my wife even angrier than she already is with me. But I would need to introduce them somewhere, in the beginning of the story, so that whenever here we have a flash forward, you already know that I have kids. Also, whenever you look at these series of events, right, I would describe here my wife is asleep. She's under like this. She's under the sheets, but she doesn't have like a heavy blanket over her. My wife is beautiful, luckily for me, lucky guy that I am. And so she's got really long, black, silky, straight hair. And, I say that she's got a strand of hair like over her cheek. She looks like she's sleeping peacefully. And my little children are asleep, next to her, cuddled up next to her. And like this is beautiful, like serene kind of image, like an angelic wife and beautiful children and all that stuff, right? Which is important for the story because that's not reality. I mean, my wife's a beautiful woman, but in the mornings, like she's not like that. Like she's not asleep. She's not asleep with like just some silky black hair just thrown across her face. My wife, she's not comfortable unless the house is 90 degrees, and I don't get down that way. I've already lived a long time I lived extended periods of time without air conditioning in Southeast Asia. I ain't doing it again. So my house is like 68, 69 degrees, and my wife sleeps with just a ton of blankets and pillows piled on top of her, and her little nose poking out, and her hair is all over her face. And as she breathes, I know she's alive because I see her hair puffing in and out with her little nose blowing it out, right? If you see that in the morning, you're like, you'd be much more likely to stay mad at something like that. You're like, getting up at 5 a.m. every day to go bust my ass to provide this. And then my kids, right, they're not peaceful little creatures. They're like burrowing like worms that just have their butts up, and they're like hairs matted in with their snot, and they're like disgusting germ creatures. But that I can stay mad at that all day long. Don't even get me started, right? So like that's important because like that changes the story. So whenever you look at this, and this is an important lesson, like it's important to like be able to change those details because my story is a true story that's not based on how beautiful my wife looks in the morning, right? Because so much so that we now know, like, you see a movie about like a married couple, right? And the husband wakes up in the morning and the wife is like in her little silk like nightie, and she's still got her makeup on, her hair's all done, all that stuff. Like, ain't happening. No woman is going to bed with her makeup on, especially if she's been married for 5 years with her hair done. Ain't happening, right? And if she does, when she wakes up in the morning, she's got like raccoon eyes. We all know that, right? Same thing with the husband, right? If the roles are reversed, because that's a very popular thing to do in movies now, and the woman looks down on her like her beautiful like trophy husband, right? He's not like got hair growing out of like weird places, and he's not making bodily noises and scratching himself even while he's asleep, like, because that's reality and that's too real for the screen, right? Because you're like, she should dump that caveman and find a sophisticated man, right? But in reality, at 5 o'clock in the morning, we're all cavemen, and women are all cave women with their hair's all gone out. Like, that's reality, right? But for the purposes of the story, it doesn't matter, right? So it works better for the story if my wife looks like a sleeping angel, and my wife and my children don't look like feral hogs, right? So those details you want to enhance, and you want to be able to manipulate to drive the point of the story. Right? Because if I see my wife and my children as these precious objects, which they are, you want to reinforce that so that it makes this conflict all the more real and all the more immediate and important. And they are more valuable to me now because of the way that I've described them, not in reality, but just within the context of the story. It's important that you be able to do that, and more importantly, what I really want you to know from that, or learn from this, is that you need to be aware when it is being done to you. Now, if you're reading a story, right? If you're reading a novel, if you're reading pure fiction, the way that characters look and are described is going to inform their character. It's going to tell you who they are. That's fine. You suspend your belief, right? The other issue, though, is when it hits a little closer to home. So, for example, and I don't know, you guys are a little bit older. Most of you guys are a little bit older than the majority of my 1301 students, which are right out of high school or still in high school. And they don't really care about like leaders, politicians, movements of culture or society, people that influence thought. But, you know, as you get older, or as students get older, people get older, they tend to care about that a lot more. So whenever you are trying to inform yourself about the people that will be making the laws under which you must live, you're going to want to know about them. And one of the most common ways you can know about them is to read about them. And it's very common to have like a bio piece, an article be written over a potential judge or a senator or a governor or a president for that matter. And what you need to look for is this type of manipulation. Whenever you are being told, whenever someone is trying to give you an unbiased opinion on someone, they're just going to give you this is a weekend with Senator Joe. Okay, Senator Joe is going to become, I don't know, or Judge Joe, and he's going to become a Supreme Court justice. Supreme Court justices, they decide pretty much what is legally moral and illegally moral, or what is legally moral and immoral in society. So let's say that Judge Joe is an old guy, old white guy, and I'm a journalist, and whenever you read these pieces, one of the first things they do is they describe their appearance. You want to know what they look like. So I describe Judge Joe as a gnarled, weathered old man with bushy eyebrows that form almost have a horn-like appearance over his eyes, and his nose is large and nearly curls down above his mustache, his bristly mustache, and his hands are weathered and deeply cracked and hard. Does that sound like a loving, generous man? No. One, he's got horns going out of his head, right? And he's hard and calloused, and his hands are cracked. Like, he sounds like a rough dude, right? That you wouldn't want to pass a sentence on you if you broke the law. Versus that very same man that could also have soft, white, not silver, beautiful, soft, feathered, Santa Claus-like hair, and calm, peaceful, loving, generous blue eyes. Like, I want that. If I get in trouble, I want him to be the one that judges me, because he sounds softer, right? He sounds loving. He sounds generous just through his physical appearance. Is he either of those things? Oh, I don't know. I'm just telling you what he looks like, right? But I didn't tell you what he looks like. I told you how you're supposed to feel about him based on my physical description of him. And so just by my physical description of him, you've already got a first impression. And that is a very, very dangerous thing when you're trying to inform yourself about the ways of the world or the people that run the world, and you base your understanding of them or the reality of them on things that are told through story form, because those details are manipulated. And if you're not aware of it, you yourself will be manipulated. Because one of the things that we've got ourselves into now as a society is that besides the lack of seeking enlightenment, is that we inform our facts so much on the way that we feel. Like, I feel that it's this way. I feel that this person is that way, so therefore it must be that way. And again, that opens us up to ripe for manipulation, because it doesn't take much really to do it. Just like I said, just something so simple as just a physical description, and that can go anywhere from body language to tone of voice to words that are how words are portrayed in a conversation, and on and on and on, right? So for us, right, I want you to manipulate these details because it enhances your story. Because again, is the story about what my wife looks like? No, not at all. It's not about what my wife looks like or what my kids look like. Doesn't matter. None of your business, right? She's ugly. I love her anyways. Shut up, right? Like, it doesn't matter. What matters is that I love her and that I regret leaving in anger. That's the point of the story. I enhance that. That is the truth of my story. I enhance that truth by the manipulation of the details around it that drive the narrative home. That's fine. Whenever you're reading a story like that, you understand that it's for that moral truth or that emotional truth that a story is trying to convey. When it comes to black and white issues, though, that's not necessarily the case. There is a documentary on Netflix called Making a Murder. Have any of you seen it? Raise your hand. That's like one. You seen it? Okay. 2 people seen it. Okay, then stop. Give up your whole weekend and watch Making a Murder. It came out, it's about a year old, I think, at this point. And it was huge when it was released. It's like 10 or 12 hours long, and it goes by in 5 minutes. And it's always a very interesting thing to see, again, how truths and stories are manipulated. So, in this 12, 13-hour documentary, I don't know how long it is, the people who put together this documentary, they spent literally years of combing through footage, actual trial footage, interview footage from the police officers, interviews of the police officers, interviews of the prosecuting attorney, the defense attorney, and on and on and on. And the vast majority of this series is actual footage of the actual people that were there while they're going through this very thing. There's a guy named Stephen Avery who the cops just don't like. They don't like him, and a rape occurs, which was a real thing. The rape was a real thing. Woman describes a guy that looks kind of like Stephen Avery, and Stephen Avery is like 200 miles away. The police don't care. They suppress evidence, don't acknowledge evidence, and then they lock him up for like 2 decades. I don't remember, it's like 15, 16, 20 years, something like that. Long time. He finally gets released, not because of the police department admitting that they suppressed evidence, but because of new DNA evidence that came to light because of progress in technology. If that didn't happen, he'd still be there. And so they let him. He's obviously let out of jail. So of course, like anybody else, he starts to sue the police department. He's got all the evidence and all the traction in the world to sue this police department, and then as soon as he's about to get his money, they mysteriously find a dead woman on his property. And the series of events that unfolds surrounding this murder and this police investigation, they don't ever really say, I mean, the documentary doesn't say whether he killed her or not, but what the documentary does investigate is a corrupt police department that even if he did kill this woman, they obviously planted evidence and they obviously did things that were illegal that would have, just by proxy, whether he killed her or not, would have caused the court case to be thrown out. But that doesn't really happen. So anyways, all that happens, and within so it took years to make this documentary, made up of real footage. And then within 6 weeks, it was like the Lifetime Network or like Hallmark or something came out with a reenactment that was the opposite side. Right? It was like, well, this isn't the real Stephen. This is a real Stephen Avery story. And they used zero evidence. They used zero trial footage, zero interview footage. It was all acted by really bad actors based on a storyline and a narrative that was completely made up, that wasn't based on any evidence whatsoever. And I remember this. I could follow it pretty closely. Right after that, that kind of bad reenactment came out, so many people came out oh, did you see the other side of the story? The other side of the story shows, Stephen Avery is like this, da, da, da. No, that's an actor acting like Stephen. Watch the documentary and you'll see 13 hours of Stephen Avery. Watch this other one and you'll see 30 minutes of an actor playing him. That's a story that is obviously written. So people very much inform their opinions about factual things around fictional stories all the time. Okay, so that's all that we're going to do today. I want